Hi, everyone. Welcome to the 1980s. Today we're going to go over section 1 of chapter 31, and this is the Republican Revolution. After Jimmy Carter was in office for 4 years, there was a shift of 12 years of Republican rule. For a while, they had Congress as well, but they held on to the White House with 2 terms with Ronald Reagan and then with George H.W. Bush. So let's go ahead and get started. Okay, section 1 talks about Reagan coming to power and what his first term was like. Second section will be about his second term. And by the way, I wore a shirt today, Reagan Bush, 1984. So this was a campaign there. He won that one as well. A little bit of nostalgia there. Okay, so if you look at the election of 1980, Jimmy Carter, he was elected in 1976. And he's running for the Democrats in 1980. It's not looking good for him. He has a low approval rating. It's only 31%. And part of this is because he appeared weak. It's not only because of the Iran hostage crisis, but also there were other things going on. There was the energy crisis. We had some real cold winters during that time. As a matter of fact, I remember hearing that we were going into a new ice age, right? So it was pretty poor at that time. The economy was bad. There was inflation. There was unemployment. And so people were very frustrated. And so his approval rating was low. Ronald Reagan, he comes in with George Herbert Walker Bush. Reagan appealed to a lot of people because he could cross over the aisle. He got what was known as the Reagan Democrats. So these people who were Democrats who were going to vote for him, they thought that Carter was ineffective as the president, and he won by a landslide. Right. So here's some of the issues from that election. One was the Iran hostage crisis. Now, if you recall, this happened because the Shah of Iran was here in the United States, and Iran wanted him returned. Most likely he would have been killed. Carter said, no, we're not going to return him. So the people in Iran rose up against the United States. They seized our embassy. Now, your book says that they took 50 hostages. They actually took more than that. They released like 13 and then some others, but all total for 444 days, there were 52 American hostages that were held in Tehran, Iran, which is the capital. There was a rescue mission known as Operation Eagle Claw that happened, but it failed. Right, so that's one of the things, as I mentioned. Also, there was high unemployment. It was about 7.5%. In other areas, like where I grew up in Galesburg, it was like 13, 14%. So whenever they were in industrial areas, it was high. In other areas, it wasn't that high, but on average throughout the country, it was about 7.5%. There was also high inflation. So there were a lot of problems facing him, and a lot of the inflation had to do with the energy crisis. Okay, so Reagan comes in, and what he did, he promised to make America strong again. That sounds familiar, right? Make America great again. But I remember Reagan really appealed to me because I remember growing up, and there was Vietnam, and then there were the years during Carter's administration. It just looked like America had lost some of what it had been, its prestige on the world market, its optimism. You weren't really proud to be American, but Reagan made you feel that way, right? And I think that is probably why he appealed to so many people who were Democrats. And one of the things, the slogans that he had was, you have to ask yourself, are you better off today than what you were 4 years ago? And of course, 4 years ago was when Jimmy Carter got elected. And a lot of people had to answer no because of the way that things had been going in the country at that time. So he chooses George Herbert Walker Bush as his running mate. So George Bush and Ronald Reagan were kind of different. George Bush had been in government for a long time. One of the things about the Bush family is that they say you have to go out and you have to make it on your own privately before you go into public service. His father had been a senator, and they can trace their roots way back to like the Mayflower. So they had been involved for a long time in government. He had been a representative from Texas. He had been the director of the CIA. He had been the ambassador to China. He was a World War II fighter pilot. So he just had this dynamic record. Ronald Reagan, on the other hand, he grew up very poor here in Illinois, the only president born in Illinois. I know it's the land of Lincoln, but Lincoln wasn't born here. It was just Reagan. Anyway, he grew up in Dixon, Illinois. He was a lifeguard up there, and he saved about 70 different people while he was a lifeguard. He went to college at Eureka College, just a small college. He played football there, and then he went on to be a radio announcer, announcing Cubs baseball games. And then he ended up in California, where he was an actor, and he worked for the Screen Actors Guild and for General Electric. And then he became the governor of California. So because he was an actor and kind of a politician and a radio personality, he was a very good speaker, right? And I think that's why people that he appealed to people, right? Carter, he attacked Reagan as being a dangerous right-wing radical, which that kind of is opposite because right-wingers typically aren't radicals. But anyway, so he was just critical of Reagan, but really didn't put forward any policies of his own. And so it was kind of easy for Reagan to win, I recall. And you're going to see on the next slide the electoral map. Okay, so you can see this map right here. Jimmy Carter won his home state of Georgia. He also won West Virginia, Maryland, Washington, D.C., and Hawaii. And then Walter Mondale was from Minnesota, and so they won that too. So if you look at it, is electoral victory. You got like 91% or landslide. You got 91% of the electoral vote. Um, and with the popular vote, he got a little over 51%, or about 51%. So if you notice, there's a candidate in there that got 6.7% of the vote, almost 6 million votes total. That was somebody from Illinois by the name of John Anderson. He was a Republican. He was up from around Rockford. He wanted to put in a gasoline tax to relieve some of the burden on Social Security, so he wanted to change that. And he appealed to some people, Rockefeller Republicans. Rockefeller had been the vice president under Gerald Ford, right, when Gerald Ford became president. So he appealed to some people. They wanted kind of an alternative around the country. So it's kind of nice to get a different viewpoint. But anyway, so they were campaigning during 1980. But so this is an incident that has to do with the election. Jimmy Carter, that he approved a military mission to go in and rescue our hostages from Tehran. And so we had a C-130, which is the plane there kind of in the middle of the screen, and a helicopter right there that they were planning this mission to go in and rescue all of the hostages. But a huge sandstorm came up and the helicopter was flying. And as you can imagine, with the sandstorm, they can't see. The helicopter ends up crashing into the C-130. There's a huge explosion. Like 8 service members died in this rescue effort. The Ayatollah told his people, well, it's God's intervention. God wants us to win. And so what that did is that really increased his popularity in Iran. Okay, the weird thing was, though, the hostages were released on the very day that Ronald Reagan was inaugurated. Some of Reagan's critics say, well, there was secret negotiations going on behind the scenes. I don't know what it was. Maybe they were fearful of Ronald Reagan. But they were held from November 4th, 1979 to January 20th, 1981, a total of 444 days. It's a long time to be there. This is where they had a yellow ribbon. It was a Tony Orlando and Dawn song. It was originally about tie a yellow ribbon around the old oak tree, if you still want me, about a guy coming home from prison. But then it was taken, society kind of took it to mean, if you're being held hostage for a long time. And now we've got it, soldiers who are gone, there's like a yellow ribbon, if you're ever wondering what that yellow ribbon was about. But anyway, the hostages were released and there was huge celebration. And that just kind of marked the beginning of Reagan's term. Okay, so if you look at Ronald Reagan, you can tell he's kind of an old fogey. He was, at the time, he was the oldest person ever elected president. And to be honest with you, I should check this. Donald Trump might have him beat. I'm not sure. So he was a Democrat. Like I said, he grew up poor. Um, Gosh, I don't remember when he was born, but he grew up in Dixon. His dad was an alcoholic, and he was really, really poor. But I remember him saying, you know, we were poor, but we didn't know we were poor because everybody was poor, right? So he didn't really think much of it. Um, but he was a New Deal Democrat. He followed FDR and he liked that. But after a while, he's like, well, this is wrong. These taxes are wrong. Taxes at the time, he's like, you know, if I only get to keep 10 cents on every dollar that I earn, then there's something wrong with that. You know, why does the federal government get to keep 90% of everything I work hard for? So he thought, well, that's wrong. And then one of his slogans were, government's not the solution to the problem, government is the problem, right? So he would kind of have that attitude towards government. He was opposed to big government, wanted a smaller government, right? So anyway, he's also known as the Gipper because he played a football player from Notre Dame in a movie where the guy, his last name was Gip, and they called him the Gipper. And because he played the Gipper, they, you know, win one for the Gipper is a slogan that, or something that he said, a line that he said in one of those movies. So anyway, he was a very good public speaker. He was witty. He was very quick. And even though a lot of people really didn't like him, people on the left, because of his policies, they did like his personality. Okay, so one of the groups that supported him, now remember with Richard Nixon, there was the silent majority. With Ronald Reagan, it's the moral majority, right? This group of people who were kind of fed up with the changes that were taking place in American society. Abortion was legal. They took prayer out of school. You know, all society was changing in so many different ways. They thought that people weren't upright moral citizens anymore. So these people were they were pushing to have more sort of moral and ethics in American society. So they're the moral majority. They were led by the Reverend Jerry Falwell, who just passed away a couple of years ago, who was a religious advisor for quite a few presidents. But anyway, they wanted school prayer. They wanted that back in school because it used to be when you came to school every day, the teacher would say, now, children, please put your hands together, and today we're going to say a prayer. But there was a Supreme Court case that said that that's unconstitutional because it violates separation between church and state. Right. This group's also opposed to abortion. They seek a strong defense. They want a free market economy where the government doesn't overly regulate business. They also oppose school busing, the Equal Rights Amendment, and gun control. So they were more libertarians, really, who wanted to kind of regulate morals. And this group of people really supported Ronald Reagan and helped him to get elected. All right. So one thing that Reagan wanted to do, though, economically, is he wanted to stimulate business. And so this is something that really differentiates Democrats and Republicans. Typically, the Democrats want to control business and regulate it so that there's a more even distribution of the wealth, and so that they regulate it for the environment, and so that you give more benefits to workers. Republicans have a tendency to believe that if you overregulate business, then you hinder economic activity, which in the end hurts America and hurts its workers because they don't have jobs. So anyway, what he wanted to do was cut taxes. Right? If you cut taxes, then that gives people more money, and so businesses could then stimulate the growth of their businesses, and then people would have more money to buy products, which thereby would increase spending in the economy. So anyway, what he did is he reduced the income tax rate on the U.S. by 25% over 3 years, and that's the top rate falling from 70%. So people at the top rate, they had to give 70% of their income to the federal government. During Kennedy's administration, it was 90%. So anyway, it went from 70% to 50%. And then people who were at the very bottom, they went from 14% down to 11%. right? When they did this, inflation dropped by 4%, and then businesses started to really boom. His first administration, though, the economy was very, very sluggish and unemployment was pretty high. So you can see this right here. Here are the marginal tax bases. So if you look right here at this area, the taxes go up during Woodrow Wilson's administration because of World War I. Then what we're going to get are three Republican presidents who lower taxes, and this is during the 1920s. But then we get a stock market crash. And Herbert Hoover, who was a Republican, he raised taxes, and then FDR raised them even further, right? And there are a lot of economists now, one most recently out of Princeton, there's also one from UCLA, who have argued that the steps taken by both Hoover, but mostly by FDR because he was in for so long, actually expanded the Great Depression and it exacerbated it and made it much worse, where it lasted probably 9 years longer than it should have. So anyway, taxes remain at 90% up here until the Kennedy tax cuts right here. So Kennedy's going to cut taxes, and then this right here, actually Johnson did it, is Reagan's first tax cut, right? So we're going from 70% down to 50%, and then right here, the top marginal ones going from 50% down to about 35%. And that's kind of where we are today. George H.W. Bush raised taxes here, but his son, George W. Bush, lowered taxes. So we are at 35%, the marginal tax rate on the top income earners in our country. Okay, so the critics of Reagan called this Reaganomics or voodoo economics. Remember, they called Nixon's economic policy Nixonomics, right? They opposed the tax cuts because they said that the programs were cut to aid the poor. I've never seen any of those because oftentimes those programs are at the state level. Also said it only helped the wealthy, and they said the tax cuts coupled with increased military spending increased the debt. The debt did increase during his administration, as you're going to see. Okay, but this is from the Heritage Foundation. This is a right-wing think tank that usually is spot on with its data and figures. Even President Obama used to quote this one. If you look right here in 1981, right, the top 1% of taxpayers paid like 20% of all revenue to the government, but by 1990, they paid 25%, right? And then if you look at the top 10%, right, the share, the top 10% in 1981 paid close to 50% of all revenue that went to the federal government, all of the money. But the amount of money they went to the government in 1990 had increased up to 55%. So they were actually paying more than they were before the tax cuts. Okay, so one weird thing that happens is when the federal government lowers taxes, the amount of money that goes to the federal government actually increases. So tax revenues increased in the 1980s. And the reason for that, many historians believe, is that when the taxes are reasonable, people are going to pay them. If they're not, if you want me to pay 70% of my income to the federal government, then I'm going to figure out ways not to pay. And so you might have an offshore account or something like that. People that are that rich have ways of figuring it out. Right. So when they said, oh, I only have to pay 35%, yeah, I can pay that. I can pay 40%. That's fair. And so they started to pay it, and revenue went up. Right. So we see that historically. We saw it in the 1920s. We saw it when Kennedy cut taxes, and then we saw it when Reagan cut taxes. And then this right here is the George W. Bush tax cut. This one was in the year 2003. They did this after 9/11. Right, cutting taxes to help to stimulate the economy, and revenues actually increase. So we have a lot of different examples throughout history where when the government cuts taxes, they get more money. Who knew? Right, here's another example. This was in the 1920s, right? They cut taxes there and revenues increased significantly, of course, until the stock market crash that took place in 1929. And that didn't have anything to do with it. The stock market crashed because people were buying and selling on the stock market, and there was overproduction. So taxes didn't really have anything to do with it. Maybe the fact that government wasn't regulating the stock market, that had more to do with it than the taxes. Okay, here, this was in 2000. This shows who pays taxes. Actually, in the United States, about 50% of the population pays very, very little or no taxes whatsoever. It's the top 50th to 100 or to the 75th percentile that do. So if you look at this right here, the top 1%, those people that earn, they're at the 1% of all money earners, they pay about 35% of everything that goes to taxes. When you look at it, those people who are in the top 10% pay about 65%. Those that are in the top 20, well, let's see, that's 10, yeah, the top 25, they pay probably about 80% of all taxes, all revenue to the government. Okay, a lot of people argue that during Reagan's administration, the rich got rich and the poor got poor. Actually, for the most part, everybody's lives improved. If you look at the poorest fifth, there's about 15% of the poorest fifth that stayed in the poorest fifth. So not everybody, right? But overwhelmingly, it was beneficial during the 1980s, economically anyway. All right, here you look though, this is unemployment. Now, it was going up during Jimmy Carter's administration, right? But it continued to rise during Reagan's first administration. But then in his second term, unemployment really started to go down, right? Then we're going to get another bump, like after Reagan left office and George H.W. Bush was in office. Okay, so shortly after he took office, so he comes into office in January 20th of 1981. But in March, there was an assassination attempt at him. There was this guy named John Hinckley Jr., and he wanted to get the attention of Jodie Foster, an actress. So cuckoo, right? He was in a mental institution until recently. But anyway, Reagan was coming out of a hotel where he had given a speech and he was waving, and then he was shot like under the arm, and the bullet lodged very close to his heart, just really close. But he goes in and he was fine. But his press secretary, James Brady, was hit in the head with the bullet, and he was completely paralyzed. And so from that, what we get is the Brady bill, which says that you have to get a background check before you can operate a firearm or you can buy a weapon. So this really changed the weapon laws in the United States. Okay, here are some images. You can see him on the top left waving. He's got Secret Service around him, which is weird because, I mean, it's not weird, but see, out of nowhere, these automatic rifles come out, right? This poor soul right here, that's James Brady, who's laying on the ground. President Reagan was being pushed into the presidential limo, and he was taken to the hospital where he was operated on, and then they took care of the others who were injured as well. All right. So anyway, Reagan comes in, and he was a Cold War hawk. Our relationship with the Soviet Union worsened during his administration because he really went after them. He called them the evil empire. And what he said we were going to do is we were going to increase our defense to show them that they cannot compete with us. And part of it really worked. It forced some real changes in the Soviet Union, as you're going to see in section 2 with glasnost and perestroika. He also proposed this new weapons system called the Strategic Defense Initiative. Everybody else called it Star Wars. So he goes on national news and he explains it to the American people. He says that if the Soviets are going to fire a weapon at us, it's coming here. There's nothing that they can do to take it down, and there's nothing we can do to stop it. But if we can fire another missile at it and explode it in space before it gets here, it'll save American lives. Oh, and then, by the way, we're going to send another missile to where it was launched, right, to take that site out so that they can't hit us. So this was called Star Wars. And this is an image of it right here. So let's say that we have these satellites up here in space, right? So what we have when a missile comes up, it can be detected, right? And so over here at Command Center in the United States, we send one missile up to destroy it in the atmosphere, and then another one's going to come over here to take out where it was launched to protect the American people. Right. So this increased defense spending, we weren't technically at war. It was the Cold War, but we built up our military. And this is when I served. And so everybody, when I was in the Army, they were talking about, oh yeah, we got everything now, because the money was tight before Reagan was in office. But then Reagan really wanted to make our make us more militarily prepared, train the troops better, have better equipment, and so that required a lot of spending. If you look at this other one, this is, you can see the Vietnam War, and before it, the Korean War, and then right over here on the right, this was after 9/11, right? And then the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. Okay, and then if you look at defense spending too, when I first made this, this is when President Obama was president, and people were critical of Bush's defense, but President Obama also maintained a high defense spending at that time, and he had to. I mean, we had troops in Iraq and Afghanistan. Okay, so a lot of critics of Ronald Reagan were saying, well, you're building up this deficit, and the deficit was large. It's nothing like it was during World War II or the Great Depression. And you'd see these deficit clocks all the time. People worried about it, worried about it, worried about it. And then that's what they were doing too when George H.W. Bush was president. And so what they did is they increased taxes. And what we're going to end up with during this time, and cutting welfare spending, is we're going to end up with a surplus, right? When during Bill Clinton's second term in office, that was all going to go away after the attacks of 9/11, right? And then we're going to have more deficit spending. But that was nothing, because this is after 9/11, right? This is Ronald Reagan. That's nothing compared to this. This was with the recession of 2008, and that is a new, what was it called? It's TARP, which was, it was spending for banks and businesses to bail them out. Bush and Obama both agreed to it during that recession. Okay, so, and then it's proposed, I don't know what it is now with the quarantine and everything, but it was proposed that we were going to get out of debt slowly, but now they've done a lot more deficit spending, so we'll see. All right, so continuing on with our relationship between with the Soviet Union and how it worsened, one thing that was happening is there's a lot of pressure in the Eastern European countries against the Soviet Union, right? So the Soviets invade Afghanistan in 1979 and they lost. It was very similar to us in Vietnam. So they were forced um, to retreat and leave, right? There's also these growing democratic movements in Czechoslovakia, in Poland, and everything else, saying, we're not going to take this anymore. We want our independence. We want you, the Soviet Union, to leave, right? Then the Soviets, they get an interim leader between Khrushchev and Brezhnev, and the guy thought that we were going to go and like invade the Soviet Union or whatever. So he got very firm against the United States, and there was a Korean aircraft that was flying over Soviet airspace. It left Alaska and it flew over the Sakhalin Islands. So it was technically in Soviet airspace. Normally they would get a warning, but they weren't even warned, and the Soviets shot them down. There were civilians on board. 269 people were killed when these Soviet bombers hit this aircraft, right? So that was horrible. And the whole world just really saw the Soviet Union as a pariah. Also, one thing bad for our relations is we put missiles in England and in Germany that could hit the Soviet Union, hit Moscow, and take them out. And so they didn't like that. So we're really putting the pressure on them. They're getting pressure at home. They're getting worldwide pressure because of things that they're doing, shooting down airliners, invading Afghanistan. All of it's looking really bad. And you'll see in section 2, we're going to get new leadership and things are going to change. Okay, so this right here, it shows the trajectory. This is where the Korean airliner flew, and this is where it was shot down, right? So this is over, these islands right here are supposed to be, Sakhalin Island is supposed to be controlled by the Soviet Union as per treaty after the Russo-Japanese War of like 1904. This is where they were supposed to fly over Japanese airspace, right? And they were on their way to Seoul, Korea, right? And when it was shot down, so sad. All right. So as I told you, there was pressure from within the Soviet Union. This guy right here is Lech Walesa. He was widely popular in the United States. He was just a worker at the shipyards in Gdansk, Poland, and he led a group of people to revolt. They wanted better working conditions. The Soviets came in and they put it down pretty ruthlessly, but worldwide pressure was on them to not do that. And eventually they're going to give in. Poland's going to become an independent country. And they really love Ronald Reagan over there. Somebody told me that there are more statues of Ronald Reagan in Poland than there are here in the United States. But anyway, they do send in troops to end the strikes. Eventually, though, Poland's going to get their independence. And this is the last slide. One other thing we're going to talk more about in the next section are events that are going on in Nicaragua. Well, actually Latin America. Here it talks about in El Salvador, the United States supported a government under the Duarte regime. There was civil war going on and we picked sides, the side that was democratic, right? Eventually they are going to have a peace treaty and they've had democratic elections ever since 1992. But in Nicaragua, there was a bad dictator, Somoza. I don't know how you say his first name, Anastasio Somoza. But anyway, he was overthrown by the Sandinistas, and this are a group of rebels who were supported by the Soviet Union, right? The U.S. cut off our aid to Nicaragua because we didn't like the Sandinistas, and the CIA backed a group of people known as the Contras. The Contras fought against the Sandinistas. The Contras were backed by the CIA. Congress finds out about it and they cut the funding. But people are going to figure out how to aid them otherwise. And this is going to be scandalous for the Reagan administration in his second term, which I will see you in section 2. Thank you for listening.